Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I was renting this small ranch house in suburban Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy. Just a typical 1960s home with 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and that open floor plan where you could see the kitchen from the living room through a wide archway. I'd been living there alone for about 8 months, and I thought I knew every quirk the place had. The electrical system was definitely one of those quirks. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, was always promising to get someone out there to look at it, but somehow never did. Lights would dim when the air conditioner kicked on. The bathroom fan would randomly start running in the middle of the night. The garbage disposal had a mind of its own, but I was paying below market rent, so I dealt with it. This particular night was in late January. The temperature had been dropping all day, and by evening there was ice forming on the windows in these delicate, crystalline patterns that caught the streetlight. I was working late on my laptop in the living room, some freelance project that was due the next morning. The only light I had on was this small desk lamp next to my chair. I liked working in dim lighting, found it easier to concentrate. I always kept the under-cabinet LED strips on in the kitchen, just for safety. The house was old enough that there were plenty of places to trip if you got up in the dark, and those strips gave off just enough light to navigate without being distracting. The familiar nighttime sounds were all there, the old furnace cycling on and off with this deep mechanical rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, the refrigerator humming its steady tune, occasionally punctuated by the ice maker dropping cubes, the soft tick of the analog clock in the hallway. After 8 months, these sounds had become like white noise to me. Around 12:30 a.m., I noticed the kitchen LED strips starting to flicker. At first, I thought it might be a power surge. We'd had some windy weather earlier, and sometimes tree branches would interfere with the power lines. But this wasn't that kind of flickering. This was more deliberate, more intentional, like someone was toggling the switch on and off. I got up and walked into the kitchen to check the switch. It was in the normal on position, but the LEDs continued their erratic pattern. 3 quick flashes, then a pause, then 2 longer illuminations, then the same pattern would repeat, exactly the same way, every time. I flipped the switch off and on again, but the flickering continued. 3 quick, pause, too long. 3 quick, pause, too long. For a moment, I thought it resembled Morse code, but I dismissed that as my imagination running wild. I mean, who would be sending Morse code through my kitchen lights? It was ridiculous. I decided to just unplug the LED strips entirely. They were on a power cord that ran under the cabinets to an outlet near the stove. I pulled the plug and the kitchen went dark. Problem solved, I thought. I went back to my laptop and continued working. About 10 minutes later, I saw a soft glow coming from the kitchen. I looked up from my screen and the kitchen was briefly illuminated. Not from the LED strips, those were still unplugged. This light was different, softer, more yellowish, like the glow from a flashlight or a phone's LED. The light lasted maybe 5 seconds, then disappeared. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my phone and used its flashlight to walk back into the kitchen. It was completely dark. The LED strips were still unplugged, sitting on the counter where I'd left them. I looked around for any possible source of the light I'd seen. Maybe a car's headlights through the window? But the kitchen windows faced the backyard, and there was no driveway back there. I checked every possible explanation I could think of. Maybe the street light was casting some weird reflection. Maybe it was the neighbor's porch light. Nothing made sense. The light had definitely come from inside the kitchen, and it had been bright enough to illuminate the entire room for those few seconds. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't concentrate on work anymore. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, waiting to see if the light would appear again. At 2:15 a.m., I heard the distinct sound of the refrigerator door opening, that soft suction pop that happens when you break the seal on a refrigerator door. I knew that sound intimately. I'd heard it hundreds of times living in that house. And immediately after, I could see the refrigerator's interior light spilling out into the hallway that connected the kitchen to the rest of the house. I froze in my chair. My blood felt like it had turned to ice water. I sat there, listening for footsteps, for any sound of movement, for anything that would indicate someone was in my kitchen. But there was nothing. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator's motor and that light continuing to shine from the open door. The light stayed on for what felt like an eternity. Maybe 2 full minutes, which is an unnaturally long time for a refrigerator door to be open. You know how it is. You open it, grab what you need, and close it. You don't just stand there with it open. Finally, I heard the gentle thump of the door closing. I sat in my chair for another few minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I forced myself to get up. I had to check. I had to know what was happening. I crept toward the kitchen, carrying my phone with its flashlight on. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. I reached the kitchen and immediately opened the refrigerator to see if anything was missing or out of place. The carton of milk was sitting on the counter next to the refrigerator. The milk that had been inside the refrigerator when I'd made myself a sandwich for dinner. The milk that I definitely hadn't taken out. The milk that was now sitting on the counter, ice cold, with condensation already forming on the sides. I live alone. I hadn't opened that refrigerator since dinner time hours earlier, but somehow that carton of milk had gotten from inside the refrigerator to the counter. I stood there staring at it, trying to come up with any rational explanation. Maybe I'd taken it out earlier and forgotten. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking. But I'd never been a sleepwalker, and besides, I'd been awake and working on my laptop the entire time. That's when I decided I couldn't stay in the house for the rest of the night. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and a jacket, and I went out to my car. I started it up, turned the heat on full blast, and spent the rest of the night sitting in my driveway, dozing fitfully and watching the house. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson and told him about the electrical issues. He came over that afternoon with some guy who claimed to be an electrician, though he didn't look particularly professional. They spent about an hour checking outlets and flipping switches, but they couldn't find anything wrong. Old houses, the electrician said, shrugging. Sometimes they just do weird things. For the next few weeks, the LED strips worked perfectly. No flickering. No strange patterns. The refrigerator stayed closed unless I opened it. Everything seemed normal, but I never got a good night's sleep in that house again. Every sound seemed suspicious. Every shadow seemed to move when it shouldn't. I started sleeping with all the lights on, which probably annoyed the neighbors, but I didn't care. 2 months later, I told Mr. Peterson I was moving out. I cited the electrical problems as my reason, which wasn't entirely a lie. He seemed disappointed but not surprised. The interesting thing is, the new tenant didn't last long either. I drove by the house a few months later and saw a "For Rent" sign in the front yard again. I later heard through a mutual acquaintance that the guy had broken his lease after just 6 weeks, claiming the house had weird vibes. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe it? A carton of milk appearing on a counter isn't exactly the kind of thing you call the police about. But I know what I experienced, and I know that whatever was in that house with me wasn't human. Sometimes I wonder if the new tenants experience the same things. The flickering lights, the mysterious illumination, the sounds of someone moving around when no one's there. I hope not. But part of me suspects that whatever was in that kitchen is still there, still opening the refrigerator, still moving things around in the dark, still waiting for someone new to notice. I was house-sitting for my aunt and uncle in Phoenix during their 2-week vacation to Europe. They lived in this nice suburban neighborhood, the kind with desert landscaping and red tile roofs that you see in all the Arizona postcards. The house was bigger than my apartment back in Denver, with a huge backyard full of saguaro cacti and gravel paths lit by these solar-powered garden lights. The backyard had this motion sensor floodlight mounted on the back wall of the house. Super bright, super sensitive. It would trigger from anything: rabbits, stray cats, even large insects flying too close to the sensor. My aunt had warned me about it when she gave me the house tour. "Don't be alarmed if it goes off at night," she'd said. "It's the desert. There's always something moving around out there." This was mid-July, so even at night the temperature was in the 90s. The AC was running constantly, and I kept all the windows closed to keep the cool air in. The master bedroom where I was sleeping faced the backyard, and that motion light was bright enough to wake me up when it triggered. The first night, I was prepared for it. Around 1 a.m., the light blazed on, illuminating the entire patio area in harsh white light. I could see the outdoor dining set, the gravel pathways, the towering saguaro that dominated the center of the yard. Nothing unusual. After 90 seconds, it clicked off. But then it kept happening. Every 20 or 30 minutes throughout the night, that light would activate. By 3 a.m., I was getting annoyed. This wasn't normal, even for a sensitive motion sensor in the desert. The pattern was too regular, too frequent. I got up and peered through the bedroom blinds during the next activation. The backyard appeared empty, just the usual desert landscape bathed in that stark floodlight glow. But I noticed the sensor was pointing toward the back fence, maybe 100 feet from the house. At 3:45 a.m., the light triggered again, and this time I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing near the back fence, beside the largest saguaro cactus. A tall figure, completely motionless, like a statue. Too far away for me to make out any details. Just a dark silhouette against the lighter-colored fence. But definitely human-shaped. Definitely not a coyote or a rabbit or any other kind of desert wildlife. The light stayed on for its usual 90 seconds, and the figure never moved. Never shifted position, never looked around, just stood there like it was waiting for something. When the light clicked off, the backyard returned to darkness. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see if the figure was still there, but it was impossible to tell in the blackness. I waited by the window for the next activation, my hands shaking. This was wrong. This was very, very wrong. Who stands motionless in someone's backyard at 4 a.m. in 90-degree heat? At 4:10 a.m., the light blazed on again. The figure had moved, closer to the house. Now it was standing near the outdoor dining table, maybe 30 feet from my bedroom window. Still too shadowy to make out a face or any identifying features, but I could tell it was a person wearing what looked like a long coat or jacket, in 90-degree weather. I grabbed my phone and considered calling 911, but what would I tell them? That someone was standing in the backyard. They weren't trying to break in. They weren't damaging anything. They were just standing there. The light continued its regular cycle. Every 25 minutes it would activate, and every time the figure had moved incrementally closer to the house. 4:35 a.m., so now standing at the edge of the patio. 5 a.m. beside the outdoor fire pit, maybe 20 feet from the sliding glass door. 5:20 a.m. at the sliding glass door itself. This time, I could see the figure clearly, tall, probably over 6 feet, wearing what looked like a dark winter coat that reached almost to the ground. I still couldn't make out facial features. The angle of the floodlight created too many shadows. But I could see that the person was trying the handle of the sliding door. The rattling sound was audible even through the walls and closed windows, a methodical testing of the door, pushing and pulling on the handle, checking to see if it was locked. That's when I called 911. I whispered my location and explained that someone was trying to break into the house where I was staying. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and keep away from the doors and windows while officers were en route. but I couldn't stop watching. There was something hypnotic about the scene. This figure in the long coat, methodically testing the door while standing in the harsh white glare of the floodlight. The police arrived 12 minutes later. The sound of their sirens shattered the desert silence. I could see their flashlights sweeping across the backyard as they searched the property. The motion sensor light kept triggering normally during their search, illuminating different sections of the yard as the officers moved around. But there was no sign of an intruder. No footprints in the gravel landscaping, no disturbance of any kind. The officers took my statement and filed a report. They said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but suggested that maybe I'd seen a large animal or a shadow cast by one of the cacti. I knew what I'd seen, though, and it wasn't a coyote or a shadow. The strange thing is, after the police left, the motion light never activated again for the rest of my stay. Not once. Even though I spent the remaining week jumping at every sound, expecting to see that figure appear again at the fence line. My aunt and uncle cut their vacation short by 3 days after I called them and explained what had happened. They said they'd rather be safe than sorry, and they wanted to check their security system. It was only after they returned that we learned something disturbing. Their next-door neighbor had a security camera system that covered part of their backyard. But the camera had mysteriously malfunctioned that same night, the night I saw the figure. The recording showed nothing but static from midnight until dawn. A coincidence? Maybe, but I don't think so. I've never house-sat for anyone since then. And whenever I see motion sensor lights in people's backyards, I think about that night in Phoenix, about the figure in the long coat standing perfectly still in the desert heat, moving closer to the house with each activation of the light. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. Because I sometimes wonder if that person is still out there in some other backyard, in some other city, standing at the edge of the light, waiting for the right moment to move closer. And I wonder if someone else is watching from their bedroom window, thinking they're safe behind locked doors, not realizing that some things don't need doors to get inside. I moved to Montana in September for a remote work opportunity. The town was tiny, maybe 100-200 people, surrounded by nothing but pine forests and mountains. I was renting this converted garage apartment behind an elderly couple's main house. The Johnsons were sweet people, probably in their 70s, and they'd converted their old 2-car garage into a small studio apartment to make some extra income. The apartment was cozy enough. One room that served as living area and bedroom, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom that had been added on. The walls were thin, and I could hear the wind in the pine trees outside, which was actually pretty relaxing most of the time. Cell service was spotty out there, so the Johnsons had included a landline phone as part of the rental. It sat on the kitchen counter, one of those old cordless phones with the base unit and the handset. I rarely used it, but it was good to know it was there in case of emergency. This particular night was in late October. The wind was howling through the trees, and the weather forecast was calling for the first snow of the season. I was working late on my laptop, sitting at the small table that doubled as both dining area and desk. The apartment felt isolated, even though the Johnsons' main house was only 50 feet away. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the occasional car passing on the highway about a quarter-mile distant. Otherwise, it was the kind of deep, rural silence that city people never experience. Around 12:45 a.m., the landline phone rang once, then stopped. I looked over at it, waiting to see if it would ring again, but it didn't. The caller ID display showed unknown number, which wasn't unusual for that area. The cell towers were so sparse that a lot of calls came through as unknown. I figured it was a wrong number or a dropped call and went back to work. At 1:15 a.m., the phone rang again. This time I answered it quickly. "Hello?" The line was open. I could tell someone was there, but there was no response. just faint static, like background noise from a poor connection. I said hello a few more times, waited about 30 seconds, then hung up. At 1:40 a.m., the phone rang a third time. I answered it and immediately heard a whispered voice. "I can see your light." My heart started racing. "Who is this? What do you want?" The line went dead. I looked around the apartment. The only lights I had on were my laptop screen and a small reading lamp beside the table, but both were visible through the apartment's windows, which faced the wooded area behind the Johnsons' property. I got up and closed all the blinds, then turned off the reading lamp. Now the only light was the soft glow from my laptop screen. At 2:10 a.m., the phone rang again. I hesitated, then picked it up. The same whispered voice. "You close the blinds." My blood went cold. Whoever this was, they were definitely watching the apartment. They could see what I was doing inside. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want?" "I'm getting closer," the voice whispered, then hung up. I immediately called 911 on my cell phone, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. In my panic, I'd forgotten that cell service was unreliable in that area, especially late at night. I considered running over to the Johnsons' house, but their lights were off, and I didn't want to wake them unless I was certain I was in immediate danger. At 2:35 a.m., the phone rang again. I picked it up on the first ring. This time the voice was clearer, less whispered, like the person was closer to whatever phone they were using. "I'm at your door." And then I heard it. Soft knocking on the apartment door. The knocking matched the rhythm of the caller's words. Slow, deliberate taps that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. "Let me in," the voice continued. "I just want to talk." The knocking became more insistent. I could hear the door handle rattling as someone tested it from the outside. I was trapped. The apartment only had one exit, the door that someone was now trying to open. The windows were too small to climb through, and besides, whoever was out there might see me trying to escape. I kept the landline pressed to my ear while I called 911 on my cell phone with my other hand. Miraculously, the call went through this time. I whispered my location to the dispatcher and explained that someone was trying to break into the apartment. She told me to stay on the line and keep away from the door, but the voice on the landline was still talking. "I see you calling someone. That wasn't smart." How could they see me? The blinds were closed, but somehow they knew I was on my cell phone. The knocking stopped abruptly. The landline went silent. I stood there in my darkened apartment, holding both phones, waiting for something to happen. The silence was almost worse than the knocking had been. The police arrived 20 minutes later, a remarkably fast response time for rural Montana. They searched the entire property with flashlights, checked the wooded area behind the apartment, and examined the door for signs of forced entry. They found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints on the door handle, no evidence that anyone had been there. The phone company later traced the calls to a number that had been disconnected for over a year. Technically impossible, according to the technician who investigated it. I spent the rest of the night in the main house with the Johnsons, who were incredibly understanding about the whole situation. They offered to let me break the lease without penalty, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to be driven away by some prank caller, but the calls continued sporadically over the next 2 weeks. Always late at night, always the same whispered voice, always claiming to be able to see what I was doing. I started sleeping in the Johnsons' guest room most nights. Finally, I gave up and moved back to Denver. I told the Johnsons it was because I missed city life. But the truth was, I couldn't handle the psychological pressure of those phone calls. The weird thing is, after I moved out, the Johnsons told me the landline in the apartment kept receiving calls. Late-night calls with no one on the line. Just that faint static. They eventually had the number changed, but sometimes, when I'm alone in my current apartment and my phone rings late at night, I let it go to voicemail. Because I learned that some voices, once they find you, don't give up easily. And I learned that in small towns surrounded by darkness, you're never as isolated as you think you are. Someone is always watching. Someone is always listening. Someone is always getting closer. The apartment I rented in Salem, Massachusetts, was on the second floor of this Victorian house that had been converted into 3 units. The building dated back to the 1880s, all dark wood and tall windows, and the kind of character that real estate agents love to emphasize. I was living alone in the middle unit, a decent-sized one-bedroom with high ceilings and wide plank hardwood floors that creaked with every step. What made the apartment unique was that it had a door to the shared basement right off the kitchen area. The basement was used for building utilities and storage, and all 3 tenants had access to it, though I rarely went down there. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had given me a key when I signed the lease, but I kept the basement door locked from my side most of the time. Mrs. Chen had warned me about the quirks of living in an old New England house. Doors that sometimes stuck or shifted when the seasons changed. Radiators that clanked and groaned as they heated up. Floors that settled and popped in the middle of the night. "Old houses have personalities," she'd said with a smile. "You'll get used to it." This was late November, the first really cold snap of the season. The old radiators in my apartment were working overtime, filling the rooms with that particular metallic clanking that comes with steam heat. I was working late on a freelance project, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when the whole thing started. My usual evening routine was pretty simple. Dinner, maybe some Netflix, and in bed by 11 p.m. But this particular project was due the next morning, so I was pushing through, fueled by coffee and determination. The apartment was quiet except for the heating system doing its thing. The radiator in the kitchen would occasionally let out a sharp bang as the metal expanded, and the pipes in the walls made soft knocking sounds as hot water flowed through them. After 3 months of living there, I'd gotten used to these sounds. At 12:20 a.m., I heard something different. A distinct click like a door lock disengaging. I looked toward the kitchen area, and the basement door was standing slightly ajar. I knew that door had been closed and locked when I'd settled in for the evening. I was certain of it. I always checked it before going to bed, just out of habit. I got up and walked over to the door. It was definitely open about 2 inches, and when I tested the deadbolt, it was unlocked. I closed the door, made sure the deadbolt was secure, and tested the handle to confirm it was locked. Then I went back to work, assuming the old lock mechanism was finally giving out. These were old doors in an old building. It wasn't unreasonable that the hardware might be failing. At 1:05 a.m., the door was open again. This time it was open wider, maybe 6 inches, and I could see the darkness of the basement stairway beyond. There was a smell, too. That musty, damp odor that comes from old basements, like mold and moisture and things that have been sitting in darkness for too long. I closed and locked the door again, making sure to really secure the deadbolt this time. I even gave it an extra turn to make sure it was properly engaged. I was starting to think I should call Mrs. Chen in the morning and ask her to have someone look at the door hardware. At 1:30 a.m., the door was open for the 3rd time. But now I could hear something from the basement. Footsteps on wooden stairs, slow, deliberate footsteps climbing up toward the kitchen level. My heart started pounding. The other 2 tenants in the building were a graduate student who worked days and an elderly woman who was always in bed by 9 p.m. Neither of them had any reason to be in the basement at 1:30 in the morning. I crept toward the open door and listened. The footsteps were definitely getting closer, climbing the stairs one at a time with a measured pace that seemed almost ceremonial. I whispered, "Hello," through the doorway, thinking maybe one of my neighbors was down there for some legitimate reason and just hadn't heard me. No response. But the footsteps stopped. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the thin line of light that came under the door from the basement's overhead bulb. Someone was standing just on the other side of the door, maybe 2 steps down from the kitchen level. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I stood there, frozen, staring at those feet blocking the light, trying to figure out what to do. At 2:15 a.m., the basement door swung wide open, not just ajar this time, wide open, like someone had pushed it from the other side, but I couldn't see anyone on the stairs. The stairway appeared empty, just old wooden steps leading down into the dimly lit basement. Yet I could still hear footsteps. Now they sounded like they were climbing past the door, entering my kitchen. I could hear someone walking across the linoleum floor of my kitchen area, but I couldn't see anyone. Invisible footsteps moving through my apartment, slow and deliberate, like someone was exploring the space. The footsteps moved from the kitchen into the living room. I could hear them on the hardwood floors now, a different sound than the linoleum, still measured, still purposeful. Then they moved down the short hallway toward my bedroom. I grabbed my cell phone and locked myself in the bathroom, which was the only room in the apartment with a lock on the door. I called 911 and whispered my address and situation to the dispatcher. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap under the door, just like at the basement entrance. Then I heard the bedroom door creak open. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, though it felt like hours. They searched the entire apartment, checked the basement, and examined all the locks and windows. They found no evidence of a break-in, no signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed or out of place. The basement appeared completely normal, just the usual collection of storage boxes, the building's utilities, and a few old pieces of furniture covered with dust cloths. Mrs. Chen came over the next morning and had a locksmith change all the locks, including the basement door. She also installed a security camera in the hallway outside my apartment, just to be safe. But the door continued opening randomly over the next 2 weeks. Always late at night, always when I was alone. The security cameras showed the door opening by itself, no human figures, no hands touching the handle, just the door swinging open as if pushed by an invisible force. I started keeping a chair wedged against the door, but I'd wake up in the morning to find the chair moved aside and the door standing open. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke my lease and moved to a modern apartment complex across town, the kind with security systems and well-lit parking and neighbors who were awake at reasonable hours. The building is still rented out, but I've heard from mutual acquaintances that tenants don't tend to stay very long. 6 months seems to be about the average before people find reasons to move on. I drive by the old Victorians sometimes, and I always look up at the second-floor windows. Sometimes I think I see movement in the apartment I used to call home, shadows passing by the windows even when I know the place is empty between tenants. But I never stop to investigate, because I learned that some doors, once they start opening on their own, never really stay closed again. And I learned that in old houses with old stories and old secrets, sometimes the past doesn't stay buried in the basement where it belongs. Sometimes it climbs the stairs, walks through your home, and makes itself comfortable in the spaces where you thought you were safe. The most terrifying part isn't what might be down in the basement. It's the realization that whatever's down there has decided it wants to come up. And once it's in your home, once it's walked through your rooms and stood outside your bedroom door, it becomes part of your life whether you want it there or not. Some doors should stay locked, some basements should stay empty, and some old houses should stay in the past where they belong. Thanks for listening, if you made it through the darkness.